Record. We are honored to present one more session of the event Open About the Unopenable with the support of Research England's Enhancing Research Culture funding here at the University of Bristol. With these events that we've been doing since May, our goal is to explore ways we can or cannot practice open research when doing qualitative methods with the so-called vulnerable participant or specific topics of research. And in each session, we had specific focus for reflecting on doing open research with specific populations. And today we will discuss about doing research on mental distress. We are excited to have with us Dr. Jacqui Lovell and Sonia Thompson. They will share with us their experiences and reflections about this topic. They will present together and we will have time for the questions, I think, throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please, we encourage you to write them in the Q&A chat box or raise your hand. We can allow you to talk. We just choose this format of Zoom webinar to be easier to then be able to put on YouTube later. So we request, of course, everybody to be respectful, and due to time constraints, we acknowledge that maybe we'll not be able to address all the questions. We want to inform everyone that the talk will be recorded. It's being recorded now and will be publicly available on YouTube in our channel where we have all the sessions that we are conducting.
All right, so if all that's clear, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Okay, our first speaker is Dr. Jacqui Lovell. Jacqui has a PhD in critical community psychology and undertakes participatory action research using arts-based co-creation processes to work in partnership with people like herself who are survivors of mental distress. Jacqui is one of the 5 co-directors of the Survivor Researcher Network Community Interest Company, our SRN. SRN is a survivor service user-led network offering peer support and mentorship to people who have experienced mental distress, who are interested in and involved in all aspects of the research process. Jacqui actively engages in and with communities in the hope of undertaking education, action, and research that supports social change to happen and reflects the self-identified problems, needs, and aspirations of diverse people experiencing intersectional discrimination and kyriarchy. Jacqui has supported a number of social enterprises to come into being in her belief that people know what they need and that working from the bottom up is the best way to effect lasting social change. Jacqui is also a Tree of Life practitioner, peer support worker trainer, research fellow, and in her spare time, a performance poet, social activist, and self-confessed granarchist.
And Sonia is one of the 5 co-directors of the Survivor Research Network, which is in, as Colin explains, UK-based user-controlled network for mental health service users and survivors with an interest in research. Sonia is currently a member of the Lived Experience Advisory Board at King's College London, a group that acts as a disruptive critical friend at the Centre for Society and Mental Health. Over the years, she has worked in ways that indirectly support the mental health of people who are marginalized in society, especially by working in the third sector. She has co-founded 2 refuges for Black women and has been active in the areas of community development and housing for many years. One of her more recent peer-based projects helped to support the mental health of Black and Asian women during COVID lockdown, where the morbidity and mortality rates in those communities were high, but the explanations for that fact were few. So we are honored to have you both with us today. Now you can take over. We just realized that Jen Fair is raising their hand. So if you would allow us to, allowed her to talk, if anything.
Hey, Jen, you can talk now.
Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand. I'm not sure how that happened.
Okay, I can tell you, Jen, how that will happen. There's a new facility on Zoom where if you put your hand up physically, it will make a virtual icon.
Oh, wow, okay.
So I understand how it happened.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, Jacqui and Sonia, now you can take over. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
So shall I start by sharing the screen?
Yes,
That would
please.
be a good start, wouldn't it? So slideshow. Sorry, I'm just trying to get it to
Okay.
start.
Straight up.
Yeah, it's because the banner is at the top of the screen, so it's hard to sort of see.
Oh, you can't
think-
see. You can move the banner.
Yeah, so I think what I'll do is I'll stop screen share. I'll get it actually up to the actual slide that we need, and then I'll share it again. Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, my bag. Oops, go back. Okay,
We'll get there.
we will, Pash. We will. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. So when I do that, and then, you know,
The banner, you can move the banner. If you
can you?
Yeah, you can move the banner.
Okay. Do you need help, Jacqui?
Sorry, I think I'm getting there. I'm
Okay.
just taking my
Just
time.
press. Yeah, you can just press on
There we
that.
go. How's that?
Okay, that's lovely. So thank you very much. I hope you all admire our first slide because we're going to be talking about democratizing research, however that might happen in real life. So we're going to look at lots of different forms of that. So a little bit about myself. Thank you very much for the introduction. Now, I consider myself a survivor researcher rather than someone who is a service user researcher. Firstly, because I no longer use services, and the services that do exist do not tend to have people like myself in mind, and so I don't find them particularly helpful. Community development is going to be a theme that I hope that you'll observe as we go along through these different slides. And community development is about collective action to solve problems with some key principles in mind, which are around democracy, participation, empowerment, and inclusivity. Now, those ideas, those values and principles have always been important to me. I have been a senior lecturer and taught for about 15 years community development. When I left academia, it was because I wanted to practice. I did want to practice in the field, and I went out and I became an evaluation manager for a regeneration company. It's quite a large regeneration company. It was a 10-year project, £70 million worth of funding. And what we did was that we provided resources for a lot of local community organisations to be able to deliver services locally. So already we're embedding resources in the local community. And we wanted to ensure that people, we left behind research skills. So what we did is that we trained those people who were project workers to carry out their own evaluation of their project, so that they could take action within the lifetime of the project and not wait until the end. They're also able to use that information that they gathered in order to fuel funding applications that they made. We also provided citizens panels, which were about making sure that we didn't over-research the area, that people didn't just come in, do research within the local community and actually leave behind more harm than good. So people came to us because we had a list of people who said that they were willing to engage in research already, and they weren't actually upsetting the balance of research. And what was important was that the people got paid. It's important that those resources are left behind, and it's not just about the researchers being able to gather data and leave. And we also did citizens' juries, and those citizens' juries were provided local people an opportunity to talk about and provide us information on how we were doing in terms of our delivery against the wider delivery plan. And that information went into the annual review every year, so that it would impact what changes happened the following year. Now, I say all that because it wasn't specifically around mental health, but we know that there's a strong relationship between social inequality and mental health issues. I say all that because I'm really focused on research for improvement, research that helps to solve people's problems and not just generate more information for the research field, or for example, just for the research exercise. So over to you, Jacqui.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. Thank you. So I'm, like Sonia, one of the co-directors of the Survivor Researcher Network. And my name is Jacqui Lovell, but nobody ever pronounces it right. So it's a lifelong struggle to get people to recognise that it's not Lovell like shovel. So I do survivor research, and I want to talk today about a little bit about my PhD research, which was called So What's Changed, and that was politically situated participatory action research. I want to share a bit about co-creative arts-based approaches, and sort of also share how I ended up with more questions than answers in terms of that process itself. So we'll crack on and introduce SRN to begin with.
Okay, so this is a little bit about the Survivor Researcher Network that Jacqui and I are co-directors of. You can get a lot of this information online, but we thought we'd bring together some key aspects of the issues that we think are important in terms of the network. It's an organisation set up by us, for us, so it's survivor-led. It's also, what we do is that we provide people a safe space to discuss a range of issues, because we recognise that the experience of being a survivor researcher within a world that basically stigmatises mental health issues, it's important that there's a safe space for people. But it's not just for people who do research, it's also for people who have an interest in research. And that's part of a wider approach that we take that is fueled by community development principles, because we realise how important it is that people come together and have an opportunity to educate ourselves, and that we explore ways of solving issues. And it is an emancipatory political process that we're engaged in. We meet every 4 to 6 weeks. We also offer things like mentoring for people. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. We do presentations. So a couple of the presentations that have taken place recently are decolonising research and co-production, research methodology, introducing the researcher as trickster, particularly within this area of work. When you do work around mental health, it is a disruptive element that we're engaged in. We also have done or we've invited people in also to explore things like intersectionality, and we also had a tribute to the activist Peter Campbell, who died I think it was last year. So the other area that I'm going to look at now is inclusivity, diversity and anti-discrimination. This is all about power. We've already started to talk about the fact that marginalisation and oppression leads to mental health issues, and this can easily be reproduce within mental health services. So it's key that we have people who are able to do research on those areas for bringing about change, because we want to challenge those systems that keep reproducing inequality, and we want to open up opportunities for all sorts of new voices in research. And so it's absolutely essential that we are as open as possible, and that we welcome diverse voices at all levels. So one of the other areas that you'll notice on the right hand of the screen, there's a talk there about patient and public involvement and the 4PI National Involvement Standards. NSON, which is the National Survivor User Network, we used to be hosted by them, but now we are an independent community interest company, and that means that we are able to set the parameters more in terms of who we can work with. We're now international. Before we were just national. What Amazon found was that lots of people were talking about how dissatisfactory they found the patient and public involvement process to be, and that what they were experiencing, they didn't consider it to really be involvement. And as a result of that, they brought people together in order, people with lived experience together in order to explore what patient and public involvement ought to be like. And they created a framework, excuse me, of 4 different areas. These are the 4 Ps. These are principles, purpose, presence and process, and the I is impact. So in terms of principles, it's about valuing the contributions that people make to the research. That's how does the organisation recognise that value? How do they make sure that they resource people effectively and resource the process effectively to value people's contributions? Because without people's involvement, the quality of the end result of whatever project is going to be much poorer. Is everyone clear about the purpose of the involvement in the first place? Why are you involving people? If it's just rubber stamping, that's not involvement. So with that clarity of purpose, people are then able to think about presence. Who's at the table? Who's making the decisions? And there's a recommendation that people are involved at all stages of whatever project is going on and at all levels. Yeah, so people within the organisation or whichever project that is being delivered, it should have people with lived experience involved at all of these different levels, and not simply at the most basic level where usually data is collected or we've completed the project, we just want it rubber stamping. And in terms of processes, we need to be exploring things like communication, recruitment, and making sure that it's all meaningful. But for me, the most important of 4PI is the I, which is the impact. What difference is this project going to make? Is it just about someone being able to they've completed this project? It actually doesn't make a difference in terms of resolving any problems. It doesn't make to the people's lives who've been involved in the project. It's merely about somebody's career. So 4PI is a great set of standards to explore patient and public involvement. So I'll just hand over to Jacqui.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. So Survivor Research Network aims to be experiential, emancipatory and holistic. So really a lot of the work that we do is based around our own lived experience and the lived experience of people that we that come to the meetings. We want to be emancipatory in terms of actually having user-controlled and survivor-led research. And we're holistic in that we take account of the social, the economical, the political aspects of the research that we're doing. So as an example of the way in which we work and how it's different to some of the more positivist research that we find, if you look in the bottom middle of the screen, you will see survivor research compared to positivist research. So where survivor research is close to the people that you're actually engaging with and the research that you're doing in terms of the process, positivist research is more distant, much more distant, distant in that people are seen as objects but not subjects of the research process. Survivor research is involved. So actually, very often survivor research is about, as Sonia said, about the impact and the outcomes of the research, as opposed to being detached and removed from the research process. The standpoint that we would adopt is usually some sort of feminist, relational, anti-oppressive praxis, whereas within positive research, the aim is for the researcher to be objective and to be unbiased in the research process, where we would own our bias and own our standpoint politically and upfront. The survivor research is understanding. We want to understand what is happening in the process. We want to understand people's lived experience. We want to understand what is happening in their world and their lives. And that's why we've looked very broadly at the social and economic and political aspects. And we don't make any claims to objectivity, which is often present within positivist research. So it's emancipatory in that we hope that by undertaking this style of research, that the people themselves will then feel like they want to do that style of research for themselves and make a difference in their own world. So really, we're all about upsetting the status quo and not maintaining.
And could I just add there, our standpoint is that society is unequal. So if you have an objective approach to an unequal society, you're likely to reproduce that inequality in your results. So that's why survivor research is very specific in terms of we want change. Yeah, we're not just having a look at what exists already. We want change.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that leads us nicely into it's more than just involvement. So you might think, oh right, then PPI. Okay, if you hit all the targets with PPI, then it's survivor research, and it isn't. Yeah, it's different. I'm just going to read out what Angela Sweeney says about this. It's different from traditional user involvement in research because service users and survivors have control over the research process. So if you come with a certain experience, a certain lens, and also with an eye on impact, you may not know exactly what impact you're going to have, but you want to have change. That shapes how you view the research that you want to do. Yeah, it's not just about collecting data. It's not just about the next paper. It's about wanting to make a difference. And in our manifesto, we say this type of user-led or user-controlled research has grown and developed from the political roots of survivor activism that seeks to challenge the psychiatric system and collectively develop different forms of knowledge based on lived experience of mental distress, which is one of the reasons why, you know, we changed what we were going to do in one of our events for the Survivor Researcher Network. And we spoke, and people spoke at length about Peter Campbell. It was all devoted to Peter Campbell and his work as a political activist. People knew him, and his approach to making change influenced the research that people do even today. So one of the pieces of research that SRN was involved with was an extension to a larger piece of research that was being conducted at a university. What happened was people on the Lived Experience Advisory Group at that university wanted an evaluation, a very focused evaluation looking at the experience of survivor researchers who had conducted research in the wider project. Yeah, so what was really interesting about that was we were interviewed by the members of the Lived Experience Advisory Group, and we reported to them. So you can see how it's possible to shift power even within a very traditional context. So it's within a university context. The principal investigator was absolutely clear that they wanted to make sure that people were deeply involved in the research. And one of the things that was important to them was that they were able to give power where they could to survivors within the entire research process. Another thing that we want to flag up is that survivor research is itself a developmental tool. In the research that we've conducted over the years, what we have found is that you have a survivor who's going out to do interviews or focus groups, because they're able to, in a lot of cases, make connections with the person that they're interviewing or as part of a discussion group. The person who's being the interviewee or the person within the discussion group will often ask the researcher how they got into the research. That sparks an interest. They have discussions about this after this is after they've collected the data, of course. They have discussions about it, and that sparks an interest in the person who was the interviewee. They want to find out how they too can start to get involved in this thing called research in terms of mental health. And you see people sometimes a couple of years later, now they're on a lived experience advisory group. Now they are researchers. Now they've gone to university. So we can see that the impact of survivor research or high levels of involvement for survivors within the research process can blossom and create all sorts of other developments that people might not have considered in the first place. So thank you, Jacqui.
So one of the things that we do at Survivor Research Network is actually support other people in terms of mentorship who identify as lived experience survivor or service user researchers. And just to highlight some of the problems that people can face, I've been supporting somebody in relation to their PhD research, and they've really struggled with the power differentials that exist within universities, and also in terms of gatekeeping and them actually getting access and being able to engage with people like themselves. And very much when you're in those positions, it's like the power is held by the university. You're trying to cope with your own lived experience at the same time as actually trying to engage with those very powerful organisations who can literally write off your research and can make decisions that massively affect the way that you do things and how you do them and who you do them with. And yet you, as the lowly PhD researcher in that process, can be, your feelings and your thoughts and your reactions to that can be completely disregarded. And if you do try to cause trouble, or you are seen as actually causing trouble and not sort of complying with the requirements of the PhD process. And then bring into that and add to that, the fact that you've got your own lived experience and your own mental distress that you're trying to deal with at the same time, is to hold yourself through a process that can be extremely anxiety provoking. And you can see why mentorship is actually really a big part of the work that we do and why it needs to happen. So this is a model that I developed as part of my PhD thesis, which was really looking at the levels of involvement and the way in which people are involved in the research process. And to be honest, I got a bit fed up with ladders and two-dimensional models, and just thought, surely to goodness, in this three-dimensional world, there's a better way of doing this. So I developed what's called the 3DP model of involvement. So three-dimensional, as in 3D, and the 3 Ps are problematization, as in who decides on the problem, and participation, as in the level of participation that people have in the process, and power. So who holds the power in that process and how do they wield it? So if you look at the very center of this diagram, you'll see that the people problematizing the issue are those most affected by it, and they participate in taking action together to solve the problem. So that's sphere 1. So that is really where survivor research sits. And that's where Survivor Researcher Network sits. We are the people that experience the problems. We are the people deciding on what we do and how we do it. And we can often participate with others and share power. And that would take us to level 2, sphere 2. So the people inside, the people who are closest to the problems that are actually happening, are those people that are actually sharing power maybe with an external organisation in order for them to solve a problem together, but you've still got the people who are facing the problem, who are deciding on the process and who are actually holding the power, working together and deciding how they're going to share their power with the other people outside of the problem. Sphere 3 is where we often are situated in terms of the work that we're doing as survivor researchers, in that the people that are furthest from the problem are the people that are actually coming and engaging with us. And they want to share a bit of power with us, which is brilliant, but they certainly don't want us to lead that research process. And then sphere 4 is where the people that are least affected by the problem are actually engaging, they're consulting, manipulating, informing, intervening therapeutically, or just placating people who actually are the closest to the problem, with no devolution of power and no involvement in the process. So that the 3 and 4 is often where the research that we are invited to get involved in takes place, but 1 and 2 is actually where we would like to situate ourselves and where we'd like to be. So it's just a way of us looking at the research process and thinking about who decides on the problems, how much participation there is from the people that are closest to the problem, and what is the power, how is the power being shared in that process. So the National Health Service, we know, is a racist organisation. We know that many other institutions, including universities, are also inherently racist, sexist, homophobic and ableist. We know that the British Psychological Society at the moment is actually campaigning for class to be added to the list of protected characteristics. And we know that power differentials in terms of mental health services are evidenced by the excessive use of force in detention, so restraint and coercion, and that's from the World Health Organization in 2021. So how do we share power in terms of co-production processes when we can't even find equity, and equity is a different concept to equality, in terms of the relations that we have in the organizations in which we're located and the research that we actually want to do, especially when it involves large institutions who have all of those problems, but often don't recognize the problems that they have for themselves.
Okay, thank you, Jacqui. So I want to talk about 2 pieces of research that I was involved in. You can see there's about 9 years difference between the 2 pieces of research. They're both online documents, so they're open documents, as openness is the theme for all of these webinars. And they're both called Jigsaw. They're both Jigsaw reports. So these are very different from the approach is very different from lots of research that you might have seen in the past. They were both, as I said, paid for by National Mind, facilitated by National Mind. The first one, the principal investigator, was Alison Faulkner. And in the first one, 10 people with different levels of experience of research were brought together from across England, and were all each given a region to try and map out or scope the nature of peer support within that area. Now, the really important thing about this is that I think it would probably hit all of the 4PI in Jacqui's diagram in terms of all of the people involved were survivors, made all of the decisions at every single step of the way. What was the problem? What was the questions we were going to ask? How were we going to ask those questions? We looked at the methodology, the method, all of the decisions about the themes that we were finding. We did that all together. Did it together. And it was quite different for me. That was a quite different way of actually doing research, because I'm used to really being the principal investigator. But I absolutely loved it. It was just such an engaging process. The things that you found out, the different ways of doing things, it expanded everybody's mind. It gave us all an opportunity to have a voice. And that is the reason why I was really happy to get involved in the second one in 2022. So we published it in 2022, but we actually did quite a lot of it over the COVID period. So we also had to explore different ways in which we're going to collect the data. Both of these pieces of research were for impact. It was research for impact. We wanted to make a difference. It wasn't just about scoping out what existed out there, for example, in the first one. And one of the recommendations that came out of that and was acted upon within a few months was Peer Fest. So an annual celebration of peer-based work within mental health, and it took place in Birmingham. So sorry for the people who are in London, but London's not the centre of the universe. You knew I was going to say that, didn't you, Jacqui? One of the things that we found when we were doing the research, when we were going out and doing the research in the first place, is how unhappy people were that every gathering was, everybody was expected to all shuffle onto a train and go down to London. So Peer Fest happened in Birmingham, which is very central. And since then, Peer Fest has been held in different parts of the country, so people can bid in to deliver Peer Fest. Another recommendation or another outcome was that Mind received funding to support organisations all over the country to deliver more peer support, which fitted in with their overall intention, which is to provide support for people where they are at and the sort of support that they wanted. The second report, Jigsaw 2, was in 2022. That was 5 people. Okay, that was 5 people who are all survivors being brought together in order to do very much the same. So it was together that we decided that we were going to focus on 3 marginalised community groups and their experience of delivering peer support. And they were the LGBTQIA+ community, young people, and racialised communities. When I say racialised communities, what I mean is people who have race foisted upon them. Some people in our society are considered to be people, and other people are considered to be people who have race. So if you're a visible minority, you have been racialised. And what comes with racialisation is discrimination and marginalisation. So we chose those 3 communities, and we were the ones who decided what the questions were, how we're going to approach people, every aspect of the process. I don't need to go through it all over again. Some of the things that came out were around belonging, sustainability, leadership, and funding. So belonging. For some people, in fact, for many people, those peer support groups were the only place that they felt safe. The only place that they felt safe. So even they were going to therapy and they weren't feeling safe there. So you can imagine, for the LGBTQIA+ community, they may not feel safe within their own family. Okay, so people were talking in general terms about feeling that this is a place that they belong, a place where they felt safe, a place where they felt connected to people, where they didn't have to explain things and where people just got it. Yeah, so you can imagine how useful that is for people maintaining people's mental health and well-being. Another area was around leadership. So the more intersectional the group, the more intersections there were, the smaller the group, because if you're already a minoritized group and you're marginalized, the more intersections that you add on top of that, the smaller the group was likely to be. And so people felt that it was really difficult to move on. They saw the value of what they were providing. If you set this group up, this group is fantastic. People are already saying it's the only place that they feel safe. But that's actually a lot of pressure on the leader to keep things going. Yeah. So the group is very much needed, but that's putting a lot of pressure on individuals who are themselves already under a lot of societal pressure. And that relates to funding or lack of funding, because as funding bodies, are also under financial pressure, there is a tendency to try to encourage groups to move into wider groups. So if you're an LGBTQIA+ community that provides specifically for people over the age of 50 within, I don't know, Erdington, you might be encouraged to widen your geographical area, or you might be encouraged to have it for all age groups. But that's not what the group wants. The group wants they feel that belonging specifically within that intersectionality. But there's a lot of pressure from funding bodies to keep, reducing that intersectionality because of funding pressures. Now, I'm now going to link to some other groups that say, yes, we provide for everybody. Yes, we meet the needs of all of these other marginalised community groups. Yet when they don't meet their targets, there is no clawback of funding. And what that means is that they get the funding and these small groups don't get them. Yet this is what we know about the need. The need is there, but funders are not responding to those needs. They're responding to groups that probably have greater infrastructure, are able to get their voice out there, are able to influence the funding process. So these are some of the recommendations that come forward, particularly around funding in order to make it sustainable. You can't be just relying on one person to keep these groups going. People are under a lot of pressure, and it's absolutely essential that these very small peer support groups are properly funded and supported to continue. A couple of reflections. If you're going to bring people together in order to explore all of these key ideas around what the problem is, methodology, you've better have good facilitation skills. You need facilitation skills. And I'm happy to say that in both of these instances, the facilitation skills were excellent. We couldn't have come up with the outcomes that we did without those skills. Another thing is around consent. Consent is really important. We did offer people the opportunity to be named within the research. Yeah, so right from the beginning, when we talked about consent generally, we said, are you interested in having your name, the name of your organisation, or both put in the report? And you will see that we do have that information in those reports if you go beyond the covers. But we then came back to people months later in order to follow up on this. And then we asked for written consent so that people had a period of time within which they could actually reflect on whether they actually did want their details there. Now, a lot of people are connected with organisations, so you can imagine, yes, they did actually want that. So it's not exactly the same as being strictly an individual, as might happen in a lot of research. As I say, people already, I think they've become political animals by being associated with a community group, but offering people that opportunity to choose, I think, is very important. So thank you.
Yeah. So what Sonia's beautifully illustrated is that even when you do open research and even when it's openly shared, it's no guarantee actually that people are actually going to listen to you in any way, shape or form. I saw somebody put their hand up a bit earlier, so if that was a hand that was meant to go up, please do feel free to put it up again and we'll stop and respond to the question. So what I want to do is to share another piece of research that I undertook for my PhD process that I think illustrates some of the questions that we have in terms of data sharing and open research, in terms of actually handing our data over. So my PhD research evaluated a community-led organisation that was made up of a lot of people from very diverse spaces and places and groups. And we were looking at what are the outcomes that matter most to diverse people with lived experience of mental distress when they engage in activities with their community-led organisation. And I actually had some questions about using participatory action research and co-creative methodologies. And I wanted to know, did they fit with the people involved? So, oh, we've lost a slide. Where did that go? Oh, yeah, it's all right. I must have done this at some point doing a fancy presentation. So the philosophical assumptions that underpin the research were based on Paulo Freire and his work in Brazil. He gave us our conceptual framework in the terms of that he thought knowledge is not neutral, but oppressed people often experience life as an object, but not a subject of their own life, and that we can often lack the critical skills to engage in what he called a dialogical process. So the dialogical process in theory allows people to question the nature of their historical and social situation. It develops the link that we have between knowledge and power through our own self-directed action. And it results in changes in both the external and internal world of the person. So, you know, you can't really do that level of research and explore the different aspects of what you're doing in the research process without it resulting in changes in terms of yourself. And it can transform the object experience of being acted upon into a subject experience of actually acting collectively together to effect change. And the other person that we drew from was a chap called Ignacio Martin Barro, who was a social psychologist, and he developed a theory of liberation psychology. And he was based in El Salvador, working with Salvadorian peoples until he was summarily executed by the CIA. So he said, if our aim is to serve the liberation needs of the people, we need to ally ourselves with poor and oppressed groups in their struggle for justice and dignity. And I'd invite you to hold the concepts of justice and dignity in research and in relation to the people that we engaged with in the research process that I'm going to share. He said we need to develop a progressive psychology that helps people find the road to their personal and collective historical fulfillment. In our case, more than anyone else's, the principle holds. The concern of the social scientists should be not so much to explain the world as to change it. And that's really sort of mirroring what Sonia said about impact being the more important part of the process. So when we actually set out to evaluate the organisation, we thought we'd use participatory video production, and we started to make some films based on our own lived experiences. So we had a democratic process to decide on the films that we would make. So we eventually did 2 films, one on what it was like to be a mummy and a daddy in an ideal world, and also another on discrimination and sexism that we'd experienced in our daily lives. And we thought that everybody would just then use the cameras, go out, make their own films, and we'd watch all the films together and decide which ones were for us most reflective of the organisation and what we were doing together. And we quickly realised that one size does not fit all, and we got completely stuck in the process. And it was only when I found a paragraph on body mapping and then brought it back to the group that we then began to map our own experiences onto our bodies. So we laid somebody down on the floor, and then we asked questions related to the different aspects of our body. So it starts at your right foot and looks at your roots and where you came from. Your right leg is the journey that you're traveling to get to the organisation. How did you travel? Who did you travel with? And then the skills and abilities you brought with you, the responsibilities you had before you came to the organisation. Your eyes were the vision of the world as you wanted it to be. Your mouth were the criticisms of the organisation and how we could do better. Your left shoulder was the responsibilities you'd taken on since coming into the organisation. Your heart was what you loved in your life and in developing partners, if anything. Your left arm were the skills and abilities that you were gaining now or wanted to learn in the future. Your stomach was the happy, sad, angry, scared feelings that you might have in your past, present, or hope for future. Your left leg was the journey that you're on now. And your left foot was where you wanted to ultimately end up. And we wanted to know if we were actually helping people or hindering them from getting where they wanted to be. So these are just a small selection of some of the body maps that people actually made for themselves. So using the Be Me tool. So you can see they're as diverse as the people that were involved. And that whole process of putting yourself down and mapping your experience onto your body was for some quite a cathartic experience. So we held a focus group focusing on the thematic analysis to actually look at people's participation in the process. And one of the things that came out of that group was the importance of relationships, the importance of knowledge and power, and the importance of the development of awareness and how safe we felt as a group within that space. So people felt really safe safe enough to be able to share their lived experience openly with others. And that was very different because a lot of the people were members of the LGBTQI plus community like myself, and a lot of the other people were people who had experienced the asylum process in the UK, which is in itself a very oppressive, stigmatizing and discriminating process. So this thematic analysis felt really, really dry, and people were like completely turned off by it. So we ended up having to like find another way into the data and into our own experiences as a group to be able to really reflect on those experiences. And I found a paragraph by Carol Gilligan that talked about Carol Gilligan et al. That talked about I poems. And what they did was they took the data from focus group and discussions, and then they made poems from the data. I was reading Butler at the time, and I realized that you can't actually have that I poem without having a you poem, because you can't have the personal without the interpersonal, and you can't have the you poem without an it poem, which is the objectified experience, and you can't have you poems without we poems, which reflect the group experience, and you can't have we poems without their poems that actually reflect the wider community level of experience. So these are two of the poems that were developed from the data that people developed with us. So it was them using their own words to put the poems together. The one on the left details an experience of one of the people that took part, and they were documenting in their body map their experience of state violence and incarceration and gang rape. And they were talking about how difficult it was for them to actually take that out and to look at it and to document it. And they'd never disclosed that experience ever in their life anywhere that they had been. And then the other one was one of the other people discussing the process of doing the body mapping and how they actually felt like they had some control in terms of what they wanted to share and what they wanted to keep inside. So we also, when I was doing the analysis of the participatory videos that we made, so people hung their body maps up on the wall, and then we filmed each other talking through our body maps to really explain our own experience. And then some of the people shared their participatory videos online. Most people shared them with family and friends. One person withdrew their data altogether and really didn't want to share it with anybody. So it was very much that one size does not fit all again. But this is one of the collective communication collages that came from that data analysis process. And you can see the level of vulnerability and protection that people actually had experienced who took part in this process. So a lot of people were people seeking sanctuary. A lot of people had their human rights negated. A lot of people didn't feel like they were free. Some people had been accused of committing crimes that they hadn't committed, but had nevertheless been actually persecuted for. So you can see, just hold that level of vulnerability, because that's very relevant to some questions that I'm going to ask. This is the actual mapping of all of the data sets that were produced as part of that PhD process. And it's the one in the top left-hand corner that was by far the largest theme, ended up being a continuum, actually. Because when we asked the questions about people's involvement in the process, connection, relationship, and disconnection was actually by far the most important. And that really mimics what Sonia was saying in terms of that belonging, that sense of belonging that people had, and the ownership over the research process. So if I actually think about this, when it came to actually writing up the research process in terms of the PhD itself, I had to face my own SHIT and also ask myself questions about trust in that participatory action process. And I hit my own shame at the point at which I began to write up the PhD thesis. And that shame in itself as a feeling is an all-pervasive feeling that often immobilizes me in terms of my own survivorhood. And I have to then look at and think about my own internalized oppression. So in terms of the democratization of the research process, I would ask, who owns the research? Who decides how, when, and with whom it is shared? And even now, I mean, this research was finished and handed in 2017, but 6 years on from that research, I have to still go back and ask permission of the people that I was engaging with in order to share the research that I'm doing. And that is every time that I share it. And some people have given me like blanket approval and are just like, yeah, Jacqui, I trust you. I'm happy for you to share it wherever you want. And other people want me to go back and ask them each time. And that's what I do based on what they need. But it's like, you know, what gives me the right? And how can I call myself an ally and then pass on this data to others who might not share the politics that we shared, who might not understand the fight for justice and dignity that we as people who took part in this process have undertaken? And how am I, as a survivor researcher, a white woman and an academic, how am I actually, in terms of the journals that we want to publish in, you know, what is the level of privilege that I have in that process? And I would also ask, what's the level of privilege that those journals and the people that are the gatekeepers to those journals have in terms of them actually being able to request that I share the data that I have? And I have to say, I, up to now, have not done so. And on that note, there is a quote by Bell Hooks, who talks about the need for a community of resistance. And to me, when I found Survivor Researcher Network, that felt like my community of resistance. That felt like a place that I needed to be. So Bell Hooks said, our living depends on our ability to conceptualize alternatives, often improvised. Theorizing about this experience aesthetically, critically, is an agenda for radical cultural practice. For me, this space of radical openness is a margin, a profound edge. Locating oneself there is difficult yet necessary. It is not a safe place. One is always at risk. One needs a community of resistance. And it's like that radical openness. Although we could be radically open with each other in that safe space that we co-created together, do I then want to diss that in a way by actually then being radically open with journals and with people that might not even begin to understand that level of lived experience? So I think that Sonia's going to share a little bit about her experience of being a member of the Lived Experience Advisory Board, which may mimic some of what I've just said.
Yeah, so this is another space for disruption. It's a space where survivors on the Lived Experience Advisory Board get together in order to have an impact on what is done by the Centre for Society and Mental Health. So I can say one of the examples was that before the last budget, remember there was almost like a snap budget. We brought together staff within the centre in order to get information online, which would be available for people who wanted to talk effectively and campaign against what was being suggested might come in the budget. And so that was one of the things that we were able to do, because as a centre, we wanted to disrupt things. It's all very well creating all of this information, but what use is it if people aren't available, cannot get access to that information in the right form when they want to be able to campaign or to complain or to give voice to their concerns. So that was one of the things we were able to do. So actually, when Jacqui and I were preparing this presentation, and I said, okay, let me just put up something from King's about the Lived Experience Advisory Board, and then I read it, and I thought, this isn't very inclusive. Iatrogenic harm.
Yeah, yeah. We were laughing. Yes. It was so funny. Because it's like, even it's a beautiful example, isn't it, Sonia? How even when you trust the organisation, and even when it's an organisation that you really are involved with and respect, they themselves can still use that excluding language. It's like, oh. Yeah.
So one of the first things I did was email. So I sent an email out, and hopefully we're going to be exploring how we can make this language far more inclusive. Yeah. So I just want to say a little bit about what iatrogenic harm is. So it's harm that comes about. So, for example, within a medical organisation, it could be to do with, use of injections or medication generally, or it could be therapy, and you use the standard way of operating, and yet it brings about harm. Okay, so you could imagine it's got quite a clear link between that and inequality, yeah, structural inequality, because if the standard of operating procedures have been designed with a majority in mind, it's more likely to cause harm to people who are in marginalised communities. And I think the more intersectional your life, the more likely it's going to be to cause harm. That's not the same as, oh, I've forgotten what the other word is, you know, when harm comes about because you haven't actually followed the right procedures, you've given injections the wrong way, etc. So there's a difference between those two. Neglects, or I don't think that's quite the right word either. But there's a difference between that and iatrogenic harm. But what I wanted to talk about was almost like flipping the script, and what the LEAB is involved in doing with an ally. I would like to call her an ally, which is Professor Kienzler, is producing an online toolkit, an online research toolkit. And the Lived Experience Advisory Board have been involved in making the decision from beginning to end, even when it means that we've had to completely go back again to the beginning in terms of looking at things that were, so in terms of the language, the content, the colour, the layout, the delivery methods such as blog, podcast, written materials, videos. And quite recently, we've been spending time looking at the launch. When are we going to do it? How, where, when, who's going to be invited? What resources do we need? It's taken us over a year of repeated meetings, exploring exactly how we're going to do it. But we're designing something which is about supporting community groups to be able to do their own research. They often don't have the resources. But anyway, if we want to make sure that those sorts of skills are available to people, there ought to be ways in which we should be able to support people to have the skills to find out and explore the problems, get to the heart of Jacqui's diagram, where people who experience the problem are able to get together and problematize the problem, and are able to explore what it means to them, are able to design the research process and carry it out and analyze it. So that's what we're working on. It's going to be a continuing process, and I will say, look out, watch this space in terms of what is going to be said about the Lived Experience Advisory Board, because we are disruptors, and I anticipate that it was going to change with the support of a whole range of different people, including, for example, the Lived Experience Advisory Board coordinator, Madison, who we recruited, by the way, based on our values and principles and ideas of what changes we want to see carried out. So thank you, Jacqui, over to you.
So we want to hand this back to you as an audience. So what we'd like, we were hoping we could do breakout rooms, but we realised that might not be possible. So we've got 2 questions that we're inviting you to ask of yourselves and each other. So how might you consider writing or putting yourself and your own lived experiences into your own research? Because we know that them and us dichotomy is a false divide, because there is no them and us, there's just us, and all of us can experience mental distress. And is there anything that you've noticed about research in general, or your own research in particular, as a result of what has actually been shared today? So we're very open to taking comments, critical reflections, and questions, and I'll stop the share there so that hopefully we can receive some of those. And I'm just going to check the chat as well, because I can see that there may be some questions in the chat. Okay. The role and involvement of ethics committees in the research conducted, and a question about how to most effectively influence funders in the decisions they make. Oh, well, my goodness. So I recently applied. I was thinking of applying for a job with the HRA, and that was basically doing some work with ethics committees. And the ethics committees seem to be changing, you know, in terms of the work that they're doing and the way that they're working, and having far more of a focus in terms of intersectionality and discrimination. So I live in hope of that one. And in terms of influencing funders, I think we as an organisation have been banging our heads on that wall for a while. So if you have any thoughts or ideas about that, please just let us know. So, oh, they want the questions back up.
Hey, Jacqui, Sonia and Jacqui. So
Yeah,
some of the attendees want the questions that you asked from your slides. Can you,
yeah.
you know,
So I'm
put
going
them
to,
in the chat box or something like that?
yeah, that's exactly what I was going to do. I'm going to put them in the chat.
We will allow, some people are raising their hands, so according to people raising their hands, we will allow them to speak,
Yeah.
say their questions. So I think it's Siobhan now.
Yeah.
Siobhan.
Siobhan.
Yeah, Siobhan, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, so I was the one who was asking about ethics committees, just because like so I come from a biomedical background, and the kind of, you know, obviously there's a lot of strictness around what kind of research you can do, and it needs to be approved by an ethics committee. But actually the process makes it very difficult to do this kind of, and I'm in South Africa, so I may be dealing with different kind of regulations and stuff. But it makes it very difficult to do this kind of interactional participatory framework. And I was wondering around, like, how do you kind of have to set that up as a separate research project before the research project, in a way, you know?
yeah. So sorry, Sonia.
I was just thinking it's an interesting point. Even when you're not researching in that particular field, when you put in a bid and you want to involve people, properly involve people, you have to find a way to pay for people's involvement in the first place before the research actually takes place. And the reality is that once the research starts to happen, and if people are properly engaged, the research is going to change again. And it's like the funding organisations, the bodies that fund, don't quite get that yet. It's like they're so far away from the reality of research.
Yeah.
You know, they're over often to the right hand side of Jacqui's diagram, and all of their thinking is happening over there. Yet a lot of the answers to the problems that people are facing are happening more in the left hand, towards the left of the diagram. And it's about, how do you influence those people? I know it's not timely. Go on, Jacqui.
Yeah. So I used to be a research and development manager for my sins in the NHS in the UK. And what I would do, and I would support people to do ethics applications and things. So what I would do is I'd go along to the ethics committee. I'd go along and I'd have a discussion with them, and I'd be really open and honest about what it is I'm attempting to do and why I'm attempting to do it, and the ways in which I want to support social change to happen. And I think sometimes when you're having those face-to-face conversations, it can be really different to what's written on an ethics form.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that does help. And then, yeah, that question about funding was also from me. And like, one of the things that I'm dealing with at the moment, my research is now in communication and support in palliative care. And one of the doctors I've been speaking to, he can see, you know, from experience, that they need more kind of mental health support for the staff who are working in those environments, but he can't get funding for it. And so there's this question around, like, how can we frame research to be basically most convincing to funders, so that he can use that to say to funders, look, we can see that this is relevant, and please put money into mental health support for, you know, healthcare professionals in palliative care.
So can I answer that one, Sonia? Is that okay? Yeah. So I'm currently a research fellow at Warwick Medical School, working on the Respect in Primary Care programme. And RESPECT stands for Recommended Summary Plan for Emergency Care and Treatment, which is all about people, when they turn up at accident and emergency services, actually getting their needs met. And what the prof that I'm working under, who's a prof of research ethics, I think what they've done is they've allied themselves to a national organisation, a national community and voluntary sector organisation called Resuscitation UK. And I think they managed to get the funding, and the funders looked on them more favourably because they had that connection with that community and voluntary-led organisation. And they very much, there was a focus in the research I'm doing, which is separating out from palliative care and it being about the control of people in terms of the treatment that they do and do not want to happen. So it may be that your research changes as a result of your involvement with that third sector organisation, but I would really recommend that in terms of strengthening your research application, you find a community organisation that identifies with the work that you're going to do. And in the UK, it would be places like cancer research, you know, some of the organisations that are really led by people who've had lived experience of having cancer and being treated and undertaking palliative care.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's very helpful.
You're welcome. So I did put the questions in the chat. If anybody feels like they want to respond to the questions, or if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to ask, or any comments or any feedback for us. I mean, we are really open to that reflective process. So if there's anybody that has got any comments about the presentation or anything that we said, you know, please feel free. We're open, aren't we, Sonia?
Yeah.
It's really weird when you can't see people's faces.
Very quiet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can I just ask how many people actually have attended today, Colin and Isabella?
We had 30, 40 people attending.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
For summertime, it was a good attendance. I have a question, actually. Maybe that will encourage people to engage more. Jacqui, I found it really, really interesting that you put Paulo Freire and Martin Baró as frameworks for
Community
research.
development.
And
yeah, Sonia's another Paulo Freire fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was wondering because I think I'm from psychology, and I know that you come from a psychology background as well. And I was wondering, because I see that the discipline of psychology, at least in the UK, is very doesn't include a lot of these perspectives. And I would like maybe to know your experiences in dialoguing with psychology and psychology.
Can I start? Can I start?
How
Can I start? My first degree is in psychology. When I did psychology, it was all about race and IQ. It was really offensive. It was very individualistic. It was incredibly stressful. There weren't a lot of Black people that were going to university at the time. It was incredibly difficult. It was almost like speaking another language. It was very much influenced by America, which also has a very individualistic approach to things. I found my heart when I found community development. Yeah. So when I left psychology, that's when it started, not because of me, but that's when it started to become more about recognizing the collective nature of society. So even though one of the subjects was social psychology in the degree that I did, it certainly wasn't anything like critical psychology. I recognize critical psychology as something that is meaningful now, but I found it incredibly difficult to have a conversation with people who didn't really understand the social context within which people were being oppressed, because everybody's an individual, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've got a story to tell. So I went to a conference at Bath Spa University and ended up in a, you know, like they have like breakout rooms and workshops and things, and ended up in a workshop with Professor Raquel Guzzo, who's a professor of educational psychology and community psychology in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And I was the only European person in that room.
So welcome to my world, Jacqui.
Yes, exactly. And that led me on a journey. And then I realized why I had really failed within the educational system when I started. She introduced me to Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was his seminal work in 1970. And I finally understood why I'd completely failed in the educational process in the UK, because we have this banking system of education where you're supposed to be an empty vessel and you just swallow everything and then regurgitate it in your exam. And that led me down a path. And I spent 3 years looking for a PhD supervisor who would actually understand where I was coming from, and eventually found Professor Jacqui, who wasn't a professor then. And she's at Rhodes University in South Africa. And I met with Jacqui yesterday, and it's the first time we've met up since I actually finished my PhD. And we had a conversation about community psychology. So community psychology wasn't even recognised up until Jacqui came to the UK. And then there was a campaign to get it recognised by the British Psychological Society. And she told me yesterday, apparently in 2 years' time, community psychology is going to be part of the curriculum in the BPS curriculum. I know, I'm like, oh my goodness.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, so I mean, the fact that we've actually got from a place where something that was based around eugenics and, oppression has finally begun to recognise that what they need is the voices and the experiences of the communities that they want to engage with in psychological research and psychological processes is like, to me, it's like a massive achievement. So I haven't actually ever joined the BPS. I might consider doing it now. If I see it actually written into the curriculum, I might actually give that another thought. But
my first job after graduation was as an occupational psychologist.
Blimey. See, gets everywhere. It does, yeah. And it's really interesting that when I worked in the NHS, I worried far more about coming out about my experiences as a survivor of adult childhood abuse than I ever did about coming out about my LGBTQI status. And there is such a massive stigmatization and discrimination that exists in relation to our lived experience that, I wasn't out about my own experience with the people that I was engaging with and the clinicians, but I was with the people that I was working with on the ground. So
I think we have another participant.
Oh, Sean.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thanks for that. That was really fascinating and interesting. I'm coming from a law PhD. So yes. And I'm looking at how lawyers who represent children who are claiming asylum in their own right work with those children and practice, do the things that lawyers do, the lawyering. And one thing that sort of, in terms of reflections, really got me thinking, and this is something I've sort of been pondering. And one of the things I'm being asked is why is this question of how lawyers work with children important? Why should we be looking at this? And I've kind of realized that I tend to start with the outcomes first, and I try to justify it in various ways. And the last point of it, and I almost feel like I can't say, that actually it's quite important to treat people decently, and that's there's a question of the rights and the wrongs of this. And as an academic, I almost feel like I can't say that actually no, what I'm trying to do is investigate why we're not treating people well in terms of bedside manner and if you will. And I just think the sort of I've really struck by some of the sort of overtly can I say moral, but yeah, principled, that's the word. Reflections today have been really interesting, and I might go away and I might be a bit more bolshy about the questions of principle. But it's quite interesting that the sort of academic, perhaps positivist, is like, what are the outcomes? Why is this important? Because of this or that, the other, not because there's a question of principle involved. It's just how we treat people. So that's That's a
Yeah.
fitting
Yeah,
point of
and I have a
reflection.
feeling Sonia's chomping at the bit to answer your question, and then I'm going to follow on because I have another take on it.
Okay, yeah. When I was doing my masters, I was in the middle of my dissertation. So I was doing my dissertation, which was about poverty in Jamaica. And I was interviewing women who were helpers. Effectively, they were maids, and they often left their own family in order to work and look after the children of people in a wealthier family. So, you know, they weren't incredibly well paid, and they had a lot of, you know, they were marginalised, all the issues that we well know about. And I couldn't bring myself to carry out the interviews without paying them. Yes, obviously it's my own money. I'm doing this as an individual for my dissertation. I could not find anyone to support me. I looked everywhere in terms of the research to try and find someone to support me. I almost thought, well, you know what? I'm just going to pretend that it didn't happen. I thought, I can't do that either. That's not immoral. That's not moral either. So I went to my supervisor and I argued for what I had done, and found ways to write it up. To me, it was unethical to not pay people, to ask somebody about the trauma of poverty and then not pay them. That for me was unethical. A couple of years later, I wrote it up. I, you know, and the only people really who were around who were supporting my suggestions were market researchers. But I wrote it up anyway. It's on an online journal now. And since then, I've had so many people come to me and thank me because they too were paying people by the back door in doing that. Now, everybody does it. So if it was ethical, you know, the argument was, oh, it's going to skew your data. Oh, it's not right to pay people. They're going to give you the answer that you want. And yet we know, look at how skewed your data is when you don't pay people. Yeah. What are you saying about the value of what evidence they are providing you, their voice? Now it's standard practice to pay people. So if it's standard practice now, it always should have been standard practice. And there was a reason why people were being denied their voice, because it was more suitable for us as researchers not to pay people. So there is something about thinking about what really is important, what the principles are, and making a stand for it, because research will catch up with you later. It's the same as in terms of co-production. Before, oh no, you're never going to. That is going to really everybody's going to consider your research to be rubbish. Now look at where we are. So there's something about taking a stance that I think will make a difference.
Thanks, Sonia. In answer to your question, Sian, I should come clean. I had 5 young people that I biologically gave birth to, and then ended up with a couple more. So 2 of my young people are young people from the DR Congo who sought asylum in the UK. And I went through the immigration and asylum process as their parent with them. And we've been in that process now for, I think it's coming up for 16 years. So in answer to your question about why it's important, both of my young people had adverse childhood events. And at the point at which we were engaging in the asylum process and they were being asked questions about their experiences, they were re-traumatized in that process, massively re-traumatized by being asked those questions. And I was often excluded as their foster parent. I was often excluded from supporting them in that court process. So it was almost like the court people wanted me out of the way so that then they could talk to my daughters without me. In fact, at one point, I was told by G4S that if I didn't stop speaking in an interview and reassuring my young person, that they would take me out physically from that interview. So yeah, so I mean, we reason why we need people like yourself to be doing the work that you're doing is because the asylum and immigration system and the legal system that's behind all of that is toxic, and it re-traumatizes people, and we do not want to re-traumatize children. And if you use the UNHCR, the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, and also the one on persons with disabilities and our own Human Rights Act, you will realize that to me, you know, we're not treating people with the dignity and respect that is their human right in that process. Does that answer your question, Sian? Oh, nodding. Yeah. Okay. All right. So somebody's saying that we don't have time for any more questions. So I am going to put my email address in the chat. So if anybody does have any questions that they want to ask, you can always email, and I'm sure Sonia might do the same. But feel free to do so. And I could see a couple of questions in the Q&A as well that we didn't get time to do.
Okay, should we? Okay, yeah, I think that's a really good session, and we have a lot of questions and engagement. And like Jacqui and Sonia said before, we don't really have time today for more questions to be answered now, but feel free to send them an email or send us an email. We will forward the questions to them so that you can, you know, connect and communicate anything that you want with our speakers. And lastly, we want to thank everybody for the discussion today, and we hope that was helpful and useful for you in your work and in your research. For us, definitely was a great learning experience. And also, we really appreciate Jacqui and Sonia for such insightful talk. And now you can see on the screen, we have a feedback survey. So before wrapping up this session, I would like to ask you all to take the next 2 minutes to fill out this feedback form. It's very short, just on something that, you know, what we can improve our next session and for our in-person event in July. So please be generous about your words. And tomorrow we're gonna have our session on doing research, doing qualitative open research with survivors of gender violence. Based on our knowledge of the speakers, it's going to be a great session. So please feel free to attend. And also, because the Eventbrite registration is already closed, and if you still want to attend, you haven't registered, please feel free to email us. We will send you the link and the password. You can just join.
Yeah, so we would just like to thank everyone for joining us today. It was really nice session. And we want to wish you a great day in a great week ahead. Thank you very much, Jacqui and Sonia.
Yeah, thank
Talk
you all.
to you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I was going to say, Sonia, do we want to debrief a bit